Alright, hey guys, today we're going to do our first demo in Sketchbook Pro. So this is a demo that I recorded in class, but actually didn't have a chance. It recorded my voice, but not actually the screen grab. So this is sort of what you guys who were close enough to me during class to see. Just a quick demo on sort of an efficient way of doing a communicative or 3D thumbnail sketch in Sketchbook Pro. In this demo, I'm actually using a Wacom Cintiq Companion 2. So it's a tablet that has a screen that I can draw on with a pen, and it's similar to the Wacom Cintiqs that you guys have in Studio, only a little bit smaller, and it actually runs Windows, which is kind of cool. The software that we're using is called Sketchbook Pro. It's by Autodesk. It looks like this. And in this demo, I'm assuming you can see my mouse. Every movement of the mouse is being controlled by the pen, the Wacom pen that I'm using on the screen. So I'm going to start over from scratch. We're going to do another drone just to try and keep things consistent with the second part of this demo, which did record correctly. So let's go ahead and start a new file. You know what, I'm going to start by opening up Sketchbook Pro. And I'm just going to go ahead and skip the quick tips area of this, the opening, and we're going to cover a couple basics first. First of all, you'll notice that there are a bunch of menus on my screen. If you have just opened Sketchbook Pro for the first time, you might not see the same menus, so let's talk about where these are and how to find them. Right up at the top here, under Window, I usually like to have my toolbar open. I also like to have my, well, if Brush Palette wasn't already open, have my Brush Palette open. I also like to have my layer editor open. One cool thing about working in the digital space as opposed to hand sketching is we can layer effects, color, shadows, all sorts of good stuff. You'll notice that the lagoon down here is open by default. It's just another way of accessing a number of different tools in Sketchbook Pro. I have sort of moved away from using the lagoon, so I'm just going to turn that off for now. And the other two things I have open are the color puck and brush puck. Those are these things over here, and if I use my pen to click on one of these, I can actually change the color of whatever tool I'm using, and this one changes the size of my tool that I'm using too. There are some presets that we can talk about for all of these things sort of as we go. Another important setup that you'll want to try and do once, and then it should keep it forever, is your page setup. I'm sorry, not page setup. Your image size. So this is something I like to work at 11 by 17 inches at a resolution of 150 pixels per inch. This is a good balance of something that prints pretty well if you want to print out tabloid size, and also has plenty of pixels to show up really well on a screen for a presentation, without super bogging down your graphics card or making giant files. Another thing that I like to do is under, there we go, preferences. Under your general preferences, all the way down at the bottom, default save format. You can save images as a TIFF or as a PSD, which is a Photoshop file. Both of these maintain the layers that we use in Sketchbook Pro, but Photoshop uses compression that I believe is lossless to keep the file size down to something that's manageable. So those are good things to do. If you haven't already added undos, Autodesk Sketchbook Pro can keep track of a lot of different undos. I cranked that up to 100 just in case. And then the rest of these, I think we can kind of just leave as they are for now. You can set some brush and canvas settings. This is another good place where you can change your default canvas size. hotkeys, adjust your lagoon settings, and all that good stuff too. So we're not going to mess with too many of the rest of those just yet. Okay, so I've opened a brand new canvas, and I've already preset a number of the buttons on my Cintiq Companion Pro to match up with some of the hotkeys that you use in Sketchbook Pro, and I'll just try and call them out. I believe they show up on the screen up here. Yeah, space. So holding spacebar brings up this little zoom tool, which you can also find up here. That will let me move my canvas around, and if I click and drag up and down on the middle of that little puck that shows up, I can actually zoom into my canvas. So I like to, for some reason, see the edges of my canvas when I draw. Just a personal preference. Okay, one more thing. Over here on the brush palette, if you don't see these tools out, I'm pretty much just using, if you didn't see that, I can click this little brush palette editor, brush library. I'm using all of the designer tools for the most part. I think I've added a couple extra ones, but for the most part, we're going to be using all of these tools, not all of them, like 4 or 5 of these tools to get most of the effects that we need for this first demo. So you can actually just like drag these over or pick this palette if that's the palette that you want to use. Okay, so I think we're just about ready to get started here. The way I like to start my sketching, and usually I don't go into the digital space until I've had a chance to draw a bunch of hand sketches to wrap my head around what it is I actually am drawing, in this case a quadcopter or drone. So if you hear me flipping through pages, it's because I'm actually looking at some hand sketches that I will use as a reference. The first step I like to do in Sketchbook Pro is do an undersketch. And that is literally just picking one of these. I think this is the design pencil. Let me just see. Yeah, that looks pretty good. You can undo and redo with Control-Z or Control-Y. And I'm just going to try and box out some perspective for this view that I'd like to try and make of this object. So I know that my quadcopter I can kind of base on a box, and at this point I'm just trying to visualize in my head how this quadcopter is going to look once I start drawing it. At this point I'm kind of noticing that my perspective maybe is a little too plain. So I can either undo to delete all of these lines and try something else, or well, maybe I'll show you another way of doing this too. See if I can't find a little bit more interesting perspective, maybe a little bit more dramatic perspective here. Yeah, that's probably a little bit better. And then I'm going to try and do more of like a 3-point perspective. So I'm drawing in like the axes for my different motors on my quadcopter. And for this one, I'm going to start by just trying to draw in about the size and location of the 4 motors. Yeah, that one's a little bit off. And I'm not worrying too much about line quality because this is just an underlay at the moment. Okay, in this design, I know that my quadcopter is symmetrical, so I'm going to draw an X through my box to try and find the middle. And then I'm also going to try and find basically like the middle plane of my quadcopter, trying to make sure that my perspective lines all sort of line up. Notice that like these horizontal lines should all be vanishing to a similar point. If they're not, now is a good time to try and adjust that so that they do. Looks like maybe these circles. Yeah, there we go. Okay. The middle of my design looks like it's going to be sort of a box. And actually, it's sort of, I might just start by drawing sort of a profile here. Again, I'm just trying to feel out like the basic geometry of my quadcopter now, so that, and actually, let me try this again. I think with this design, I'm going to have the body of my quadcopter be a little bit higher than the plane where the motors sit. Yeah, they're going to have like angled arms coming up. I'm just trying to feel out the shape as much as possible so I can set myself up to have a really nice, simple drawing. Okay, I might draw in some of like the profiles of my motors. That one's sort of hidden behind here. I guess I'm okay with that. I can move items on the page. I guess the best way to do that is just to highlight everything and kind of like scale it down, move it up a little bit. Let me go back to my pencil tool. Let's see. My arms are going to come in. Looks like I have sort of a waist on this design. That's kind of what that's going to look like on the bottom. It connects to my arms. We kind of connect like that, and then jump out. Again, I'm just trying to get a feel for how these arms are supposed to connect, and that last one is totally behind there, which is fine. This motor might come down just a little bit more, and this might be enough geometry for me to kind of get going with this design. I'm going to put a camera. Whenever I draw a cylindrical object, I like to try and put the axis in place. It gives me a good reference for how ellipses are supposed to look on that object, or I guess on that axis. Okay, I think we're getting close. There's my undersketch. Again, now's a really good time to evaluate whether or not you're happy with the perspective of this object and if there's something you want to change, because the rest of what we're going to be doing is a little bit more about like finding the right line work and adding value, color to communicate this idea. So, let's see. Yeah, I think I'm okay with this. And it looks like it will have some sharp details. Okay, so this layer. Another thing you'll notice about Sketchbook Pro is many of these items that have these little like 8 dots on them, if you press and hold with your pen, a hidden menu will pop up, and I'm still holding my pen. If I drag in any of these directions, I can select the options that pop up. I'm going to drag across this name, like naming your layer option, and let go. And I'm going to name this my under sketch, just as a reminder to me of what is on that layer. Now it's also probably a good time to save your file, and this one for me is going to be drone demo number 4. Okay. All right, so there's my under sketch. Let's create a new layer. Oh, and if you didn't catch that, let me get rid of this layer really quick. On the layer menu, if I press and hold and then drag up, there's an add layer, and you'll see I have a second layer. Another thing you'll notice is my under sketch. I'm going to turn down the opacity by sliding this little blue bar, just so I have enough of a reference for my next layer, but it's not really. It's just there as a reference, so I can kind of turn down the opacity. All right, I'm using the same pencil. I might increase the size just a little bit. Again, how am I increasing the size? I have this puck set up to increase the size of my pencil. If you don't have your puck set up that way just yet, there's a brush properties menu you can open, and this is also where you can drag to increase the size of your pencil. I think I had it right about there. So, oh, and it might just have like the basic. Yeah, I would keep it on basic. That's the size of your pencil. And once you have it ready, you can leave that menu open or close it. Test out your pencil. That looks pretty good. I'm going to undo and start drawing this thing. Okay, so normally, during my undersketch, I didn't use any of Sketchbook Pro's guide tools, but it does have a few useful guide tools, and one of them is an ellipse tool. Best way to use the ellipse tool is play with its little settings to set up where the axis is. You can increase the size and scale of your ellipse, and then you're actually going to use your pen to trace this guide circle that's set up. Your line will sort of snap to that guide, but you still have to draw it. So I'm going to start adding a few of the lines that I imagine I need for this. Motor. And looks like I've got bottom of this motor also. Is more of like just an organic rounded shape. So I'm just going to scale up and do it that way. Okay, so there's one motor. I'm going to do the same thing to these other motors, or motor mounts. Sort of change the size, scale, go through the same process here. I am sort of thinking about how these objects would look a little bit different from their slightly different perspectives. This motor being at a more extreme angle, you're probably going to see more of like the top portion of this motor than you do looking more at the top of the motor over here. We are still going to see the inside of this piece. And again, I know when you're using a template, I know when I'm using a template, I tend to want to be a little bit more of a perfectionist. This is still a sketch. We're not doing a super high level rendering, so try and resist the urge to make everything line up perfectly. Where we are in the design process with this idea is such that I have a few different arrangements of the core components of the quadcopter, and I'm trying to communicate those different arrangements, those different versions. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time thinking about arrangement of components and using Linework to communicate that, and a little less time thinking about like high-level edge details and textures and things like that. Because we're not ready for that part, that conversation yet in this design process. All right, and that last motor is sort of hidden. Okay. Anytime I'm happy with Linework, like in this case, I'm happy with those three motors, I'm going to go back up and save. And now I'm going to start working on this central body. So that kind of comes around like that. Curves up the back. And although there is an undo button, it's okay to be a little bit loose in your line work right now, because again, this is just for communication of an idea, trying to facilitate that conversation. Let's see, we've got sort of the inside edge of this thing. My screen tends to get kind of hot, and sometimes my hand will start sticking to the screen. If that happens, maybe keep a paper towel or something around so you can wipe your hand off. Let's see if I can get this camera mount in place. Probably right about there. I'm kind of building these shapes in my head as I'm going here. So, for example, this one in my original sketch, my original hand sketch, it's sort of split halfway up this piece. So I'm going to go ahead and sketch in that line. I think a contour line might help me communicate what's happening here. I think it might also help me communicate what's happening around the front here. The fact that this is a lens that might have like a domed edge. I probably have some like hidden geometry inside here. I can do some like light shading to kind of communicate what's going on here. I will come back and do some real shading with some of these other tools soon enough. Okay, that's another thing I'm relatively happy with. I'm going to save. Now I'm going to do some of these arm details. So and again, I'm like following the sketch that I had outlined below in my undersketch. So that's how I'm able to sort of, in a single stroke, get a lot of these lines. That's not quite right. Might hint at how these sort of come together. And again, we're not seeing that back motor. So, okay, I think we're getting pretty close. I noticed there are a couple details in my sketch that weren't in my underlay, in my undersketch, and I'm talking about my hand sketch, a couple extra things. So I'm going to create a new layer here, and I actually have some straps that are supposed to work as a part of this design. So I'm going to build out a little area for this strap to live. And I noticed I created a new layer so I can go back to one of these other layers and use a different tool, an erasing tool. I'm actually going to get rid of some of these lines so I can update the contour to match what's happening now. In this new design. So there's like an area for a strap, and it looks like I'm going to need another little area. Oops, I'm going to make this on this other layer. Let me just like ghost about where this strap is going to be. Put in another spot for the strap to fit through. Like that. You probably see part of the edge of that. And the strap is going to, I guess, dive. Maybe I just want it to end there. Yeah, let's see. I'm trying to create an area for a battery strap to go. And I need the battery strap to come out through the bottom of this to hold the battery in place. So the strap might come around, something like that. My battery is going to get stuck to the bottom of my quadcopter, like right down here. trying to indicate maybe where that battery is going to be strapped to the bottom of my quadcopter. That's fine. Alright, I'm going to add in the strap. And the strap has some thickness, so I'll make sure that's a part of it too. Probably see that edge the strap disappears into. You probably see the edge coming around the back here. Okay. That's kind of the way I want it to look. One thing I might do to emphasize if it's something that can come undone is like show the strap maybe pulling up and off the other side of this. And that might be a way for me to, or a good place for me to put an arrow indicating what's going on. Okay. So I'm getting pretty close with my line work. This is probably the longest part of this process, is making sure your lines are nice and clean. You can stay loose, but it's translating that geometry from your undersketch into a single layer of line work. So once you have your line work done, you can actually merge layers. I don't know if you caught that. Let me undo a few things. Yeah. To merge a layer with a layer below it, you can click on that menu that pops up and drag down, and it will merge two layers together. And so you'll see I can turn on and off this layer, and you have your line work, or I guess I have my line work. So I'm going to save. And there's another layer of line work I'm going to do really quick. With my same pencil, I'm going to increase the thickness a little bit more and go back and emphasize some of the areas of this sketch that I'd like to emphasize. Mostly thinking about like the outline and in general some of the areas that I'm most interested in talking about in this sketch. So in this case, I think I'm going to try and put most of my emphasis right here generally. So I'm going to try and like thicken up the outline in this area of my sketch to communicate, where, emphasize the outline of these objects, emphasize the parting lines, and overall just draw in the viewer's eye a little bit more to this area of the sketch. I do want these lines to follow the existing lines that I've already placed, so it's not getting hairy. That's a word that we've used to describe line work that is maybe just looks a little too overworked. This might also be a good time to bring that ellipse tool back if you want to emphasize, let's say, like the front edge of this motor area over here. Darken that up. I'm going to darken up inside edge there. Going to emphasize certainly the outline of my motor. I'm just sort of resizing this ellipse template until I have kind of the size I'm looking for. So those are the areas I was really trying to emphasize here. I'm pretty good with this line work. You know, there's one other line I might add here, back to a smaller size, because this, I imagine, is a parting line. Like these two pieces might come apart. I'm going to go back through. Oops, that's not quite big enough. And basically like duplicate that line. You know what? I might be able to do that with a highlight. That's fine. So, okay, my line work is finished. I'm going to go ahead and label that as line work and save. I'm going to turn off. I either click the eyeball here or click and drag across hide to hide my undersketch. And now let's start going through and adding some color. There are a couple other lines. Realize like these aren't really communicating the shape very well. I might go in and add a couple contour lines just to kind of show what's happening in that shape a little bit more. Yeah, I think that's better. Okay, I'm going to make a new layer underneath my line work, and my next step, if the first step was, and I guess I can put these over here somewhere too. So the first step was my undersketch. With an emphasis on geometry. I'm sorry, perspective. My second step was line work. Using all of the techniques we have already talked about in class to use contour lines to sort of emphasize the areas of your drawing that you want to talk about as a part of this sketch. Try and keep all of your lines following a single perspective, that kind of thing. My third step is going to be color blocking. And this is a step, even if you scan sketches in and bring them into Sketchbook, there are a lot of different ways that you can add color and value to a sketch. I'm going to show you probably one of the more efficient ways to do this if this idea is not far enough along to warrant you spending like an hour making it this most beautiful photorealistic rendering. Instead, if you just want to add a little bit of depth to your sketch, these are my steps. We're going to do some color blocking. We're going to add shadow, and this is sort of like a cell shading technique. And then we're going to add highlights. These layers, these 5 steps, are also going to be sort of our 5 layers once we're finished with this file. Okay, so we've done line work. I'm going to start with some color blocking. And this is really simple. Usually I like to do grays and a single color, depending on what I'm trying to emphasize. In this case, to try and keep it consistent with my other concept, I'm going to pick like a nice middle gray, and I'm going to use this tool called Dream Brush, and I'm just going to start coloring in the components that I want to be this gray color. In this case, it's the arms and sort of like the bottom half of that, the body of my quadcopter. The nice thing about the Dream Brush is that it has a very wide range of like thin to thick, depending on how light or hard I press on my brush. And it makes it really easy for me to fill in, like block in color. The nice thing about, one other nice thing about Sketchbook is, and we're going to kind of talk about this more and more, you can erase. And a lot of my workflow in Sketchbook Pro has to do with adding color or value or shading, highlights, that kind of thing, and then going back and erasing away the areas that I sort of like overshot with my highlights or color. It's sort of like a plus and then a minus. You add things, then you take away what you didn't want. Now, for some people who work in Photoshop a lot, as opposed to Sketchbook Pro, there's a great tool in Photoshop that I don't believe has really made it into Sketchbook Pro just yet, and if it has, I haven't used it yet, called masking. And that's an idea that you can sort of set up areas in your sketch ahead of time, and then when you add color, shadow, highlight, that kind of thing, it sort of limits it to a single area rather than having to go back and erase like I'm having to do now. All right, so that's one color. I'm going to actually create another layer underneath my gray color to add my second color, which I'm going to do sort of like an orange. Eventually I'm going to merge these things together. So I'm going to block this all out. Okay. Looks like I might have to use this eraser again to just like clean up the back. And let's see, what color do I want my camera should probably be like a really dark color. And if it's too dark, there are a couple of things we can do to get around that. Yeah, that looks like really, really dark. I can change the opacity of this layer, but I've got orange behind it, so I might just delete this layer and start again with just like a little bit lighter gray color. You know what, I just might make this entire piece inside here sort of this gray color. And then I've got my strap. I might make the strap that gray color too. Again, because this sketch is not like a final rendering, I'm mostly using color to help communicate different components, and because I already have a sketch of another quadcopter concept, I'm going to try and use the colors to communicate the same thing. So in my other sketch, the orange component was one that was sort of like the top half of a clamshell design, and this one, it happens to be the bottom, or it's still the top half of a clamshell design. It's just broken up a slightly different way. My battery down there, let's see, I might keep that sort of like a nice light color too. Oops. And I'm just creating layers as I need to make sure I can block off my color. Once my colors are all finished, I can actually combine those things together. And again, I've been asked this before, like, why don't you just leave everything in a separate layer? You can, and it lets you go back and change things, but I've sort of found that my workflow in Sketchbook Pro, I like to treat more like a sketch in that I do merge things often, and rather than like having to dig back through layers to find and tweak minute details, I'll just erase a few layers and start again if I need to. It lets me stay a little bit more loose and not fret so much about the details. I am going to color in that arrow. I think on my other sketch page I used like a light minty green for the arrow. Thought that was kind of cool. Go back and erase away the parts that I don't want. And I might actually, just for the heck of it, really quick go in and like add just a little bit of shadow to the edge here. Make it seem just kind of a little bit more 3D. Okay. That's color blocking. Cool. And I'm just going to label my layer color. Done with that. I'm going to save. Once you've blocked out all the color on your object, now we can start going into shading and highlights. well, shadow first and then highlights. This is where you can spend a ton of time if you want to do a bunch of airbrushing and textures. But again, this is just like a rough idea. So I'll show you sort of an efficient way to go about doing this. So again, I'm going to use my dream brush. For adding shadow, I'm going to pick a nice, oh, and if you don't see this menu here, there's this little checkbox or checkerboard menu up here with a bunch of grays in it. I'm just going to pick like a middle gray. And I'm going to change the type of my layer. So see how my layer 14, which I could label shadow right now, it's a new layer. I'm going to change the type of it to multiply. All right, let me show you what that does. I'm going to go back to normal. I'm just going to paint some, well, change the size of my brush again. Okay. This is something that's relatively new to Sketchbook Pro. I can change how Sketchbook treats the opacity of one of these layers by choosing one of these different types, these like blending types. Multiply will take that gray I just added to my layer 14 and kind of multiply it across any other colors that are beneath it. So it's a great way to add shadow. So let's see, I'm going to undo and change my layer to multiply, and now I'm going to start adding shadow. So I'm going to imagine that my light is kind of coming from mostly like the top of this object, but also slightly behind the object. And that means most of my shadows are going to be on the side and bottom of this object. And I'm going to try and, oops, I didn't mean to undo there. Try and just paint in where I think these shadows should go. In this case, my main object is kind of round, so I'm going to make sure my shadows are nice and rounded on this side of the object. And then, because I'm not really worried about, I'm kind of thinking about this main volume, this main area first. Looks like my shadow would probably come down underneath as well. And eventually it's like wrapping around the front of this thing like that. Okay, so that's shadow. I can erase away the areas I don't like. And actually, because the band is sort of following the same plane, but it's sort of sticking out of that surface a little more, I'm just tweaking that shadow a little bit. Add some shadow to the inside of my surface here. And again, notice I'm like adding some shadow and then taking away where I didn't want it to be. Switching tools. Got shadow like on this side of this. Probably up here too. So like the top of this and its edge are probably going to be in shadow. And I'll come back through and erase away what I don't like. Probably the front edge and the side of my orange piece here should be in shadow. Come back through. Erase what I don't want to keep. And I'm not really worried about cast shadow just yet. We'll do that in a second. Sometimes it's helpful for me to create a new layer, also multiply a layer once I move to another component. And actually, while I'm still here, like the top of these arms are not going to be in shadow. So I'm just going to erase what I have so far for where those connect. We're probably going to add shadow back in. Alright, so add some shadow to the front of this, around the back of my motor. I might do the front of this arm too. And definitely the back of this motor. Definitely the back of this motor. And most of the side of this arm. Because these are smooth pieces, I'm trying to make sure that the line where it breaks between shadow and not shadow is nice and smooth too. Oops. Erasing also works with your ellipse templates if you wanted to use those. I generally try not to use them too much for anything other than line work, unless I have like a really tight highlight I'm trying to add. Okay. I can combine those two layers together and make a new one that's also a multiply. You get like the inside edge of my motor mounts. Again, I'm not thinking about the cast shadow inside here just yet. We're going to do that next. Just thinking about okay. And again, I'm not worried about airbrushing. I'm just doing a single, yes, it's in shadow, or no, it's not in shadow kind of value pass here. To keep it simple and efficient, not wasting time. Okay. Next, so I'm going to make sure those are combined. Now I am going to do some cast shadow. Oh, you know what? I missed down here. Oop. Another multiply layer. My battery is all going to be in shadow down there. At least most of it is. Okay, combine all those. Now I'm going to do some cast shadow. Same thing, I'm going to pick a nice middle gray, maybe a little bit darker than the gray I was using before. Use a multiply layer. And cast shadow, what do I mean by that? That's where objects like this lens would probably cast a shadow beneath it. And what adding a cast shadow does for these sketches is really helps add some depth to objects that are like overlapping. So like inside these motor mounts, this is a hollow area. That would all be in shadow, cast by the edge of the motor mount. This too would have a cast shadow, probably something like that. Oops. I'm just sort of imagining where if my light is coming from mostly the top and also slightly behind this object, where are my heaviest cast shadows going to be? And I think that might be most of them. I guess I could add cast shadow to my battery area from where the arms cast a shadow and where like the top, like the body casts a shadow. need. Okay, so I've blocked off some shading, and I think taking a step back, I can multiply these things together, or just merge those layers together. Let me get rid of this line, arrow. I'm starting to see, taking a step back from the sketch, most of what I'm trying to communicate in the sketch is being communicated. It's still pretty loose. It's not, you know, beautiful rendering, but at this point I can tell that like these arms are kind of rounded, that these motor mounts are hollow, that this is sort of like a rounded surface also. And it's enough to have a conversation about what this is supposed to be. I am going to add some highlights too. For highlights, I like to use white, that same design brush, dream brush, and then like as I start drawing, I'm actually going to just turn the opacity of this layer down a little bit to say like 76, sure, to start. So let me erase that. And for highlights, I'm just going to try and think about what areas are going to be most intensely hit by light. So like probably the top of this orange piece, oops, is going to be in highlight. I can get rid of the areas where I don't want it. Let's see what else. Probably the tops of my arms here are going to be in highlight. I probably want to leave a little bit of a gap between the highlight and wherever my shadows are. Definitely like the top portion of my lens here would be in highlight. And maybe even a little bit on the bottom of my lens. I just noticed that I might want to add some cast shadow that I missed on the inside on these, like this black piece here. Yeah, that looks good. Go back to white, go back to adding these highlights, and erase away. Let's see a little highlight there, and I'm going to go back and adjust that cast shadow also. It should be pretty dark inside here. My strap is probably going to have some highlights too. I might make a new layer with the same kind of properties, my white brush, to do the highlight for my rope. It's in sort of a slightly different area. And I want to be able to, when I erase, not have to worry about ruining highlights on other areas of the sketch. Okay. Add a little highlight to the top of this here. Those are probably the big highlights. It looks like maybe I could do a highlight on that side here. I guess I could probably extend the highlight to part of this face here. Okay, that's probably about it. And that's probably about as far as you need to take this level of sketching. Now let's think one more time. All right, so we did our undersketch, and let's go back through these. I'm going to merge these layers. I'm going to call it highlights. And let's go back through really quick of what just happened. So we started with an under sketch that had our basic geometry underneath here, some basic outlines of some of our components, and we were really just double checking that our geometry looked okay before we made our line work. After we made our line work, trying to emphasize with different line weights an area of the sketch to focus on. We hit our under sketch and blocked in some color. After we blocked in color, again we used a couple different layers to block out each of these colors and merge them together. We added shadow, trying to pick a single light source to use for our shadow. Then we added some highlights to the top of our object where it would really catch the light, and that's really just about all we need. If you wanted to do a few more things to maybe make this sketch pop just a little bit more, and again, this is sort of like a 3D thumbnail. It's not really a rendering because we're not worried about a ton of other details. A few other things I like to do sometimes to make this pop would be change the background color to something that's a little bit darker. That way our highlights stand out a little bit more. If that's the case, you can actually go back through and erase any edges of these highlights that maybe we didn't see when it was white on a white background. You might go back through, if you wanted to emphasize this even more, you could add, make a new layer with a nice dark gray, multiply gray, and do a drop shadow. Even just like one of these fake drop shadow ellipses to make it seem like this object is floating as opposed to just sitting on the page somewhere. No, this thing would not have a shadow that's round like this, but it's enough to emphasize that it's, you know, floating above the ground. I could move that layer a little bit if I wanted to, kind of center it a little bit more, maybe pop it off the ground a little bit more. I think that's okay. A few other little details. You could always go back to your line work and add a little bit more weight in areas that you think need more emphasis. I know we didn't really do this very much. We're not using, well, if you wanted to spend another 30 seconds adding a few more highlights to areas that you thought could use a little more emphasis. Edges really like highlights, so I'm using my design pencil with some white. I might come through here and just emphasize that edge and how it might catch some light. I might do the same on the bottom, like this part here, which is a party line, just to call out that edge a little bit more. Same thing here, like the top edge of this, where my strap dives in. And yeah, actually that might be enough just to make that area pop out just a little bit more. Maybe the top edge of my lens a little bit, to emphasize where some of this geometry is on a different layer than like this battery down below it. We could add a little bit of color down there to simulate light coming around from the backside. And honestly, that battery just looks like a lump of nothing right now. If I were going to do it again, I might find another way to kind of just hint at the fact that there's a battery down there without going so far on the shadow. Yeah, so that's about as far as you need to take like a 3D thumbnail in digital sketching. I've talked through a bunch of the techniques. In general, a thumbnail like this can take as little as like 20 minutes or so, depending on how complex your object is. You can put a bunch of them on the page. And another nice thing you can do in the digital space is if you run out of room, like let's say your sketch starts off in the middle of the page and then you really start to run out of room, you can always resize your your objects. A good way to do that is to create a folder that's a group. Use Shift to select all of the objects that are associated with your sketch. Make a new group, like copy that group and merge it, which is fine. And now I can actually move that whole layer around. Oh, and I've got, well, that's fine. I can move that whole layer around if I wanted to change the size and orientation of this thing a little bit, so I had room for a few more views on the same page. So, okay, that is my intro to to Sketchbook Pro demo, and hopefully it's useful to you guys as you keep going. Just as a reminder, let me say really quick, the other demo that should follow this video is this guy. Let's see if I can open it up with Sketchbook Pro. And it was sort of using some airbrushing and other techniques, including bringing a texture in from an image file, using some dodging and burning and blurring and erasing to give you sort of a little bit more high resolution rendering style on a similar design concept. So this would be sort of next steps once you were further along in the design process. So look for that video next. Thanks everyone.